hi everyone. Thanks for clicking on our video today. My name's Logan and I'll be your host, walking you through 10 simple steps of how to make a yeast starter. So in this form of a yeast starter, you'll need a few things. First off, you're going to need some dry malt extract. In this case, I've already measured it out for the proper volume. Next, you'll need to have a flask or some other vessel to boil and ferment in. Lastly, you'll need to get some yeast. This happens to be a Yeast Smack Pack. Now for the steps. First step is to make sure that all your equipment is clean. This is an essential process in any type of brewing, whether it comes beer, wine, mead, or cider. Without clean equipment, you can easily contaminate the beer. Second step will be to smack your pack. If this is dry yeast, it won't be an issue. This is just something you want to do to get the yeast going ahead of time so that they're ready to pitch into the starter. Next, you'll want to add some dry malt extract to the flask. As you can see here, I'm making quite a mess. After that, I generally like to go over to the sink and rinse the dry malt extract down into the flask, and then fill it about half of your volume with some water. After you get that proper volume, you'll want to shake it around a little bit and try to dissolve the dry malt extract as much as possible. This just keeps the flask clean as possible. Next, you'll put the flask on a stove and turn your heat up to a fairly low amount. In my case, I have a glass top, which is not recommended. If you have a propane or natural gas stove, this is ideal. Otherwise, do not do this on an open electric element. Hey everybody, so now it's the point where my flask is just coming up to a boil, and right now I'm going to start watching it like a hawk, because probably as I speak it's starting to boil up, and these flasks really have a tendency to boil over. The last thing we want is a bunch of burnt sugars on our stove. Once you get your wort up to a boil, be careful not to boil over. These are bad and this will make a giant mess. After you've boiled for about 5 to 10 minutes, you can take some foil, place it over the top of the flask. If you want, you can sanitize this foil, but it won't be necessary due to the heat coming off of the flask. Once you have the foil on the flask, you will have to remove it from the heat and chill it. I found that the best way to do this is in a large pot of cold water. Generally, when I add the water to the pot, I will fill it just to above the line of liquid within the flask. This keeps the flask from trying to float. After about 5 minutes, you may find that the water in the pot has warmed up significantly. At this point, you'll have to dump that water out and replace it with new cold water. You may have to do this 2 to 3 more times in order to drop the wort down to the pitching temperature, which is usually right around 70 degrees depending on the yeast strain. As always, folks, remember to read, follow, and understand the safety guidelines of your beer brewing equipment, and always wear these safety goggles. Once your wort has been significantly cooled, it's as simple as pitching your yeast into the flask. If this is liquid yeast, it's a matter of cutting the bag open and pouring it in. If it's dry yeast, it's a matter of sprinkling it on the surface. After this, you'll want to give the yeast a good shake. This helps to disperse the cells amongst the wort, as well as oxygenating the wort, which is essential to cell growth. After you do your initial swirl, you'll want to go by and swirl it up as much as often. So place that flask in an area that you're going to be around frequently until you pitch the yeast into your main beer. If you don't want to swirl this flask, another option is to buy or build what's called a stir plate. Stir plates use a magnetic stir bar to create a continuous whirlpool within the flask. This takes that extra step of you having to swirl the flask from time to time out of the equation, and also helps to supply that small stream of oxygen to your starter. Next, you'll want to make sure that you have your flask properly labeled, so as not to confuse it with any other starter you may have going on at the time. Last thing we want to do is pitch a Saison yeast into an IPA. Within about 12 to 24 hours, you should notice that your starter is actively fermenting, and at this point it is ready to pitch. You can pitch it within that 24 hours or after that 24 hours. Either way, you're going to end up with a much better off beer. Finally, pitch your yeast into your full-size batch of beer. What you'll probably notice when you do your starter is that the yeast almost instantaneously begins to ferment the beer. And within a matter of hours, you will have a full krausen, whereas without starters, oftentimes it can take up to 1 to 2 days. This will ensure that your beer does not have any off flavors associated with yeast stress, and it will also make sure that your beer attenuates out. Stuck fermentations, especially on high gravity beers, are a real issue. And last but not least, enjoy the final product, something that you can look forward to being fully fermented and often with a cleaner flavor profile that it would otherwise have without a starter. And best of all, yeast starters, other than your time, usually cost less than $1 to make for a standard 5-gallon batch. Cheers, guys.